Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today for the conversation is our co-host, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst. Welcome to the show, Cliff. What are we going to be talking about today? It's been a busy week.
It has been, and it is a wonderful day, but yes, very busy weeks for both of us, and we have a lot of news that can only come from us. First, we're going to talk about the Workday Innovation Summit that you were at, Stacey, out in the Bay Area. I'm sure it was beautiful there. And then currently, I was at the Meeting of the Minds Summit, which ADP put on in Atlanta. We'll finish it up by talking about some funding news that has come through. And then we have a little bit of I don't know what you want to call it, little surprise information. You'll just have to stay tuned to find out what's going on.
Is anything the EEOC does really a surprise? That's the real question, right? All right. Well, yeah, it's a busy week, right? And then on top of it, we have we've been together this week. Like you're actually in North Carolina where I'm at this week, right? So we'll be talking a little bit about some of the updates we're doing this week at our team meeting, right?
That's absolutely right. And that might explain my overly cheery mood because it is absolutely wonderful weather here. I am in Asheville, North Carolina. And yeah, before we get started with all of those other, and I don't want to say lesser get-togethers, we got together, us at Sapient Insights Group. And this was my first time getting to meet everyone in person, but we also had a lot of really important things to discuss.
You know, it's so funny, the virtual world that we all live in, right? I don't even think twice about the fact that you hadn't met some of the partners of the company yet, right? Like we had done everything virtually when you had been hired. I knew you, I'd had a chance to meet you. So yeah, this was the first time, we're still a bit of a small organization growing rapidly, but we've got together sort of our core team of team members who work on the research and work on our consulting side of the business, and got a chance for people to meet each other who hadn't met each other really because we'd worked so virtually. And it was a good week. We spent a full day talking about sort of where the company was heading, what the opportunities we had for sort of growing some of the areas that we've been wanting to focus on. And then we spent a whole day talking about the HR system survey, which is now your big sort of baby, right, Cliff? I mean, it's been hard to let it go, but you're really managing it well. I mean, that's a big part of what we did this week, right?
That's right. And for you listening at home, in your car, wherever you're listening to this, you should know that we really do take all of your feedback very seriously. In fact, that's a large portion of what we're doing is going through any feedback we receive in this survey from others that we've talked to and find ways to streamline it, to make it even easier to get through, to get the most relevant information that everyone is asking for. So you're right. It is a very exciting work that we have in front of us. But as you said, it is like a baby, and we're growing it into a wonderful child. I'm not taking it from you. We're
It is time for me to have multiple. It takes a community, right? We know this and it definitely has been a community developing this research over the last 25 years. But it's a lot of work to constantly be thinking about whether or not we have the right questions. Are we getting to date most valuable to the market when it comes to not just HR technology, but all the processes and systems and strategies that go around it, right? I think that's always been a big part of when I took it over from Lexi Martin over 8-9 years ago now. My goal was to make sure that we not only kept what she called the gravitas of that research, I always love that word, but that I honored that it was an ever-evolving bit of research. It wasn't something that, although we asked a lot of the same questions so we could get longevity and understanding of how things changed over time, we were also always adding to it. And we've continued to do that. And I'm glad to see that you and the team are also doing that. What are some of the new areas that we'll be covering in this year's research that you guys are working on right now, Steve? Cliff?
Yeah, no, besides the focuses we've always had, we are actually going to be calling out in particular rewards and recognition. That will have its own section this year. We are going to separate skills out from learning due to how that has sort of evolved into its own area. Onboarding separate from recruitment in general or talent acquisition in general because of its heightened importance, I think, especially in the world we're at now, and the areas that could integrate, along with lots of other sort of smaller changes that reflect what has happened in the market. And also, again, the feedback that we get from all of you, which, as always, Stacey will give you all the contact information at the end of this podcast. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you have any ideas or suggestions.
Yeah, we love to have a conversation about how we can sort of adjust the research on an annual basis to sort of achieve a broader value proposition for the community, because we know it is a community effort. So yeah, I'm excited about some of the changes you guys are making, because they're areas that I know I for years have been like, I need to find time to do this. We weren't sure if they were enterprise level. A lot of them have come up over the last couple of years, and we know that they've been major investments for a lot of organizations. And so they're areas we wanted to invest in more. I also think we will be adding a few more questions on performance management. We talked about that, getting some more data on just the approach organizations are taking to performance management, because we recently did an outreach effort on that and found there wasn't a lot of standards and data around that yet in the market. And not surprisingly, there will be a few questions about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Not to say that we haven't had that for almost 10 years in our research. We've actually been asking about intelligent platforms and intelligent tools since 2014 in our data set. But we are going to be asking a little bit more about what's holding people back, what's the barriers. Do they understand what their vendors are providing for them? Some of those kind of questions, which we know are relevant to both the buyers and the vendors themselves, right?
That's exactly it. And that's a wonderful point. And I think a wonderful segue, because I believe that discussion around intelligent tools, artificial intelligence, and machine learning was something that was discussed at that Workday Innovation Summit that you attended. Is that right?
It was. And in fact, the actual summit was called Artificial Intelligence Machine Learning Workday Innovation Summit. So it was like they labeled the theme of the entire Innovation Summit. Now, it's important to note that Workday has a lot of events throughout the year. They've got their annual Rising events, both here and in the other regions. They've got regional events they run. They've got different influencer and partner events. This particular Workday Innovation Summit has, I think that they were saying that it's been back since. They noted that one of my friends, Vinny Marchani, had been like the longest standing analyst to have been there. And it's been, 10, 15 years or whatever it's been since sort of the first year of Workday's founding. And so I was, I've been there probably 8 years, almost the same time since I started joining Sierra Cedar. And I will have to say, it's been interesting to watch not only Workday sort of transform and grow, but also to see sort of the analyst and the coverage and the variations and changes of what's happened in the market. Now, it's important to note that other vendors like Oracle and SAP and Cornerstone and any very large vendor, particularly those who are public, will have these, what they call analyst days is what they call them. There's specific opportunities for industry analysts to come in and learn and get an understanding of what's happening inside those companies at a little more in-depth level than they would at maybe just a customer event. And oftentimes we have financial analysts there as well. And, there are those who are sort of interested in funding as well as those who are interested in the industry topics. Sometimes they separate them. It just depends. And it's really meant to be a chance for us to get a chance to ask some of the questions we hear. At least that's how I take it from our customers. And this particular event was focused, I think, on, ChatGPT had just come out. There was a lot of focus on where artificial intelligence was coming. It's been, I think, this conversation for some time in the ecosystem as to who was first to the game in some sense on some of this. Is anybody being left behind? And I think Workday was very consistent in their message, and they wanted to make sure it was very clear that they've been working on artificial intelligence and machine learning for a long time. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, we talked about this last week or the previous week, that there is a current lawsuit that they are facing, which is at this point in time going through the systems around the Workday and its use in recruiting processes. Mm-hmm. And Workday basically couldn't comment on that as they shouldn't as a public company when it comes to something like that in the open market. But I think, what we're going to see in the market is that a lot of vendors are going to be facing these kind of challenges. Is artificial intelligence something that we should be sort of using on a regular basis? Is it, how do we manage it? How do we ethically and introduce it into the market? And a lawsuit that's happening in the market, and again, we talked about it in the previous one, so I would go back and listen to it if you have some questions about it, is one of what I think is going to happen to many of people just sort of testing the waters, seeing like, is there any concern about how we're handling our data inside artificial intelligence, the bias that might be inside of those data sets. And I think it was pretty clear in this event that, Workday's taking every one of those comments and conversations seriously. They feel very strongly that they have a really secure and sort of sound basis for their artificial intelligence around from an ethics perspective. They're one of the few organizations who started out very early with an ethics board. They have the person who heads up sort of the artificial intelligence and machine learning efforts is Cheyenne Chakrabarti. And I apologize, I'm not going to get his last name correctly, but to be honest, Cheyenne is probably one of the, at least from my perspective, one of the most humble, but really understands at a practical level the nuances of what's happening in artificial intelligence and machine learning. In fact, he was recently over the last year asked to be a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee for the U.S. Department of Commerce. He's actually one of, very few a list of other sort of highly selected individuals who actually advise the president on topics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. They're a group of people who've been selected who know this industry very, very well, and Cheyenne's one of them. And even though he advises at that level, he was at this event here walking us through the steps that Workday takes to ensure not only that they've got security and ethics and that they're using artificial intelligence and machine learning in a way that is appropriate for their customers and appropriate for the community as a whole, but also sort of reminding us that, yes, it's exciting about where we're at with ChatGPT and all of this. But one of my favorite images that he put up on screen was this slide that kind of showed the trajectory of the ability to learn of artificial intelligence. That's the best way that I can describe it. Maybe we'll post it when we post this segment, because it was a great sort of one of those Moore's Law kind of charts where, we saw this sort of 40 years of sort of slow but surely sort of increasing amounts of data that could be processed and or analyzed in by machine learning technology. And then all of a sudden there was this uptick of almost 7 times, 10 times the amount of processing and 7 times 10 times the amount of analysis that could be done by these algorithms over the last probably just 2 or 3 years. And that kind of speed meant that this was, a 60-year-long overnight success for machine learning, right? like what we've hit is the pinnacle, and there's obviously more to go, but it's maybe will not go quite as fast of similar to when we were first starting to do sort of the internet and cloud. And we hit a point where it made more sense and more speed and processing that we could get out of the cloud environment than we could in our own on-premise environments. We've now hit a point where machine learning and artificial intelligence can basically do the math faster and do the processes faster and learn faster to some extent, which I think is the real conversation, than human beings at this point. Now, what's most important to remember, and I think this was very clearly defined by Cheyenne, was that it's still math, and it's still, they only know what was historically put into that training data set. And Cliff, you and I have talked a lot about this, that there's a conversation that we have to have in the market that artificial intelligence, machine learning it has a place, it has a use, but it's not at the point yet where it is doing sort of completely ready to be the sort of next level sci-fi that I think a lot of people are really afraid of, which is something that can generate new ideas, basically, right?
That's right. It's not going to, on one hand, it's not here to do your job for you. You don't need to worry about that yet. But no, really, what it can do at this stage is assist you with things, but it will only be as good as the data that it has and the information that you can give it. This is where a lot of discussion about bias comes in, because if you are feeding historical data that isn't quote unquote good because it has been affected by bias, say for selection or assessment, then it can only work with the data you have. So it's just very good practice to be mindful of how these algorithms work and to think about that when you are using it, when you're in selection, to ask those questions about how the algorithm weights information that it's getting in, how it uses that for decision making. You don't need to be a full data scientist. And these vendors will be very happy to explain how it is that the decision making is happening. I think the most commonly cited example is Netflix, but that's because it's kind of obvious and useful, right? Based on your past interactions and experiences, it uses that as a recommendation engine. But there's lots of other applications in the world at work. We've mentioned the recruitment side, the assessment side. It can also be used for succession planning and internal pipeline development. It can be used in their learning applications. There's really a lot of different ways that these programs are going. And now with the advent of ChatGPT and other forms of large language processing, large language models, they're more commonly called, you can use that to do things like develop, job descriptions and to help write things based on the information that it has, both from your organization and from others. So I think it's good just to be aware of it. On one hand, I wouldn't be scared, but it's also worth possibly maybe just lowering your expectations a little from the fact that, I won't have to do any work at all, right? We're always going to need highly skilled and experienced HR professionals, but that does mean you do need to be aware of the tools that are coming in and how they're best used.
Yeah, I equate it very similarly to, I can remember when my kids were in high school, at that point in time, the internet was pretty just an accepted fact, right, for how they would go and research things. And I remember walking them through into the library and saying, when I had to research a paper, I had to go into the library and figure out which books things were in. And I couldn't just type into a search engine, right? Like it was something that I had to sort of think strategically about how I would find the data, pull it all together. I think what we're going to see with what's happening in ChatGPT and some of the other ones is very similar, that kind of next step. It will change how we think about our work and the businesses that we run, because it will optimize and improve performance, but it's not going to fundamentally change the work that needs to be done. It might just speed up like a calculator would, or like, we no longer put side by side our schedules to figure those things out. It will hopefully improve performance levels, but it is something that I think what we're really looking for is not just that it does it for us, but it does it for us with a level of intelligence. And so what you're going to hear a lot of, I think, from the various vendors who have applications is that we are not just using these algorithms and not just using these tools to more quickly and more effectively do natural language processing and use the LLMs to sort of do a better job at answering our questions effectively, but that we are putting intelligence in them by making sure that we're adding business information and knowledge in the right places to get the data in the clean data sets, that you're not using it on everything on the internet, which is not a clean data set, right? Those are the conversations, and you're going to hear the conversation more about intelligent platforms. I think that's the term you should really be watching for, more so than all the other stuff that we're hearing in the market. One of the things I do want to mention is some of the other things that we heard from Workday this week that I think are relevant for everybody else. I mean, they did walk through every place within their environment where they had embedded basically artificial intelligence and machine learning through this innovation summit, and places they were thinking about embedding it. And there's a lot of places like, Workday's help desk environment, Workday's adaptive planning, which by the way has more customers than any other application in Workday's module environment. They're up to 10,000 customers now, and a lot of that has to do with the adaptive planning tool set. How organizations were bringing in external data with internal data to do mix with the adaptive planning through their Prism technology. They were really walking through all the examples of how people were using a mixture of intelligent artificial intelligence that they had embedded into the system, and all the different ways that they were using good business processes to tie that together so that these things went hand in hand. The one they focused on the most, which I think has been a big mantra for Workday for many years that you had alluded to, is skills management and career management. Skills management fundamentally was an architecture that Workday had built probably from the earliest days of designing their platform in the HR space. It was one of the earliest things that I had talked to them about as an analyst. And fundamentally, what they're doing with skills is that it's an underlying piece throughout almost every HR and even some of the finance and business, especially when you talk about planning and advancing careers and those kind of things, data sets across the platform. And it isn't just that they have an ontology or a set of skills that they've gathered and scraped and built into the system. The thing about their skills management is that it is driven by artificial intelligence. It continuously learns and updates, and it builds a profile and is managed by the employee first. And that's a very big difference from what we're seeing in sort of the competency management model, and where we see that oftentimes that's much more managed by the company itself, right? A competency model. We manage and update. We do job role analysis. What Workday has fundamentally done is said, look, we're going to point it to all these things where it should gather data about what skills you would have. And then it's going to basically build a skills profile. And then you as an employee can validate which of those skills make sense for you, which ones you're working on. And then we had a case study that they had in there with Accenture, which I thought was a really good case study. Accenture is both a partner and a customer, so it's important to note that. They do a lot of implementations. They have used the extended platform tool to build out some additional skills capabilities. They're selling that as part of their packages. But one of the things they had mentioned is that they had built an algorithm, which I thought was really interesting, that evaluated when was the last time you used that skill and how long did you use that skill to give each skill a level rating. And as anybody who manages competency management knows, that's the hardest part, right? It's okay to say that I can do speaking well, but can I do speaking well in front of a small group, in front of a big group? Can I build my own presentations? Do I have to have somebody build them for me? That is all about sort of how long you've been doing it and when's the last time that you did it, right? And so that algorithm that Accenture has built sort of has, or at least as they talked about it, has given them what they call a relevancy and recency number. And that gives them sort of the value to every skill that is applied to in place. And they said that's really changed the dynamics. And I thought it was an interesting way to think about skills management for organizations, that you really have to come on what's most important to you. Is it that they've ever had that skill, that they might need a skill, they're building that skill? That's what becomes the value you place on those skill sets. The other thing that we got a chance to do while we were there is get a chance to talk to Carl, the new co-CEO, Esteban. He was really emphasizing his focus on customers. And he was very clear that if you take care of the customer, then the growth will come. And because there was a lot of analysts who were asking about whether or not Workday could sustain the level of growth that they've had for the last several years. And I think the short answer was yes, but not at the sort of 40% level. We're going to be at the 20% level, because that's just what happens when you're a big company. And I think that makes a lot of sense from everything that we've seen in the market. Nobody at that size grows that rapidly, but they are continuing to see growth. And they showed a lot of data and numbers on where they're at from a growth perspective. But Carl felt that a lot of opportunity they had was speaking to organizations that maybe had not had an opportunity to work with Workday in the past. You're going to see them probably focus on customers who are just starting the transformation journey, where oftentimes they were really big on finding customers who really focused on transformation, more international focus, more mid-market focus, and definitely more industry focus was definitely also some themes that we heard out of sort of the entire day. So there was just a lot of good conversation. We had really good walkthroughs of the products from the HCM product strategy group. And we just saw some really interesting stuff on how they're marrying the artificial intelligence and machine learning in workforce management and payroll and contingent workforce management with the Vinley purchase they had created. So I would watch that space. I think that's going to be one of the bigger things that they're doing. But it was a packed day and a half of just nothing but content and how they're tying together these systems in a way that I think in the market is important. Cliff, that's a lot of information for our audience, right? But I know you then went to another event that was almost just as big. You were at ADP's Meeting of the Minds at the same time that I was at the Workday event. Maybe contrast that with some of the stuff that I just talked about. What are some of the things you're hearing at the Meeting the Minds event as well?
Well, Stacey, you mentioned the very upfront theme that Workday had in those, in intelligence and machine learning. There wasn't a stated theme at the Meeting of the Minds event, but I want to tell you some of the sessions and some of the breakouts and just some of the speeches, the talks that were given, and see if you can figure out the theme. And for those of you listening, you can play along too. We had, right after the beginning, building employee trust with data-driven experiences at work. We had using data to shape the future of work. We had harnessing the power of people analytics. Do you start to notice there's a trend going on? What was really happening is that ADP is really pushing on the importance, obviously, of data and how that can help small to medium-sized businesses really differentiate themselves from their competitors. And I think that, one aspect that may be a sort of different take or a different side of what we were talking about before is they're really focusing on using these intelligent tools more in automating repetitive tasks, right? Closer to that RPA side, where they are focused on the time that can be freed up, the energy that people will feel, and the engagement people have when they don't have to just do repetitive tasks, such as time entries or payroll movements and that type of thing, and tax compliance checks and all those sort of things that they can help with that can bog down HR people, instead allow them to make more strategic decisions and to use their people skills on their own. So it was a sort of another aspect of where we are all at in the world of HR, and different ways that the digitization and the datafication of the workplace is accelerated, especially after these last few years of more people working from home and everyone becoming more comfortable with looking at the numbers as they come through things. The only other session I'd like to highlight is that the entire event kicked off with a talk from Nella Richardson, who is their chief economist at ADP. Yes, ADP has their own economists. They're that big. So obviously, it was important for, I think, everyone to hear what they thought about the general economy. And I think probably listeners may be interested too. They are seeing an uptick in hiring. There was a big drop. If you see the sort of trend line, you can imagine it steadily increasing up until the 2019, 2020 pandemic years. And then it's back and it's above where it was before. But it's slow growth. So they believe that although hiring is growing, it's growing slowly. But the other issue is there has been as much wage growth that goes along with that. And so there are still concerns about inflation and how that will affect the general economy. So I found that pretty interesting. It was nice to be able to have that data from ADP based on what they are seeing in terms of real numbers from the paychecks coming in, and how this might affect those of you at home. It should be worth thinking about not just the hiring numbers, but look at where you are in terms of your wages that you're offering, and think about how that is, in line with inflation and real costs, especially as more and more of us are hiring in multiple locations. And again, another area, right, where we could see intelligent tools helping us make those decisions of setting compensation levels and where wage increases should probably be applied, and where you're going to find the greatest leverage in terms of retention, engagement, enticement for people to take new jobs. So I did find that pretty interesting. Sort of they were putting their money where their mouth is, saying everyone should make decisions based on data, and we're going to provide you with that data. Yeah. There were some really wonderful.
I'm a little upset, Cliff. You didn't let me pick. You just went ahead and said it was about data. I was gonna say it was about data. Sorry. Had well
done. Well done. And for those of you listening at home, if you pick data, you're correct. If you didn't, please let us know. I'm curious what you thought it might be. Yeah, it was really wonderful. And I'm going to go ahead and plug us. I was sitting in on the Power of People Analytics discussion, Sean Paris from ADP, and they used Sapient Insights Group data without any knowledge that I was in the audience. So that it shows that there's, outside views that really find value in the data, as they should, as all of us should. We should find data that we trust. I think we've talked about trust quite a bit. And I think that is what underlies all of this. And I almost kind of want to tie it back to what we were talking about when we were talking about the use of intelligent tools. That's why it's important to know what's happening with the processes, right? With the machine learning and how those recommendation engines are functioning, at least slightly, have a brief outline of how it's so that we can trust that we know why they're making the decisions that they are, or how they're, making the recommendations that they are, I should say.
Well, and I think it's trust also in how that it's not just about how the decisions are being made, but trust in where those algorithms are getting additional data from and where our data is going back to as well, right? That was a big conversation we had at the Workday event. I'm sure you probably had it a bit at ADP, yes. Which is once those algorithms come to our environments, we're also retraining them again, right? Like, one of the things I think they said at Workday is that we train our models often to 60 to 70% and assume they get trained the rest of the way in the environment of that individual company because that's their unique sauce. And then the question goes, well, does that data stay there? Does it go back? That's sort of the federated versus non-federated model of sort of machine learning. And there's been a lot of conversation about that with the recent TikTok that's actually, I think, going on today as we're broadcasting this. Where does the data sit? Who has access to the data, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's an ongoing discussion. I think it's definitely something we'll be tracking. And I think that there's no clear answer except that more information is always better. And it's always better to be mindful of understanding sort of how these processes play out and how they work so that we can ask the right questions from our stakeholders and our suppliers and our vendors.
Yeah. I think, one of the things that you and I have talked about, and we're probably going to start working on something around this, which is on a practical level, all this stuff gets very exciting. And there is obviously some productivity improvements that we're going to see, very similar to when the calculators came out or when the computers came out, right? Everybody has to adjust to say, oh, this is actually, I should shift how I work because now I've got a tool that will help me work faster, better. But I think the bigger point is what questions should people be asking of any of these tools, of any of these vendors, of any of the even free, open, available tools before they sort of depend on them for decision-making and or put their own data into them, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. You've hit the nail on the head. So yeah, that is definitely something you should look for because that's what we want to remain focused on is what does this all mean for you? How will this affect our sort of day-to-day lives? What should we be knowledgeable about? Where can we look for help from our HR technology? And what should be things we should keep an eye on or be concerned about or, be wary of as well?
So outside of these two big topics of these events that we went to, which were pretty big, right? I mean, I think those are probably areas where we get a lot of our data on things we need to make sure are included in the survey from the sense of, do the buyers understand any of this? Did they find value in it, right? That's a lot of the reason why we go to these vendor events is to understand what the vendors are sort of presenting their products as. But there's also this conversation about how much do you trust the overall company that you're working with? I mean, ADP, Workday, both major players in the market, long-standing financial, metrics, but then there's new companies that are coming about like Rippling and Gusto who are a little bit newer to the market and dealing with much smaller organizations, oftentimes the very SMB market, and lots of investment going into this space. So we were going to talk a little bit today about the funding of an additional funding that was raised by Rippling, which is an SMB HR. Well, they call themselves HR finance and IT system. Now, finance, I think, has a lot more to do with expenditures, but there's some other things that they're doing there. IT, they're doing sort of some management of software and network analysis and those type of things. this actually was a company that is started by Parker Conrad, who many of you might remember was also the CEO of Zenefits back in the day before it became TriNet Zenefits, and got into a little bit of hot water, well, quite a bit of hot water, actually, for doing some unethical things around the benefits training and some things that they weren't allowed to do with how they were selling benefits in various regions. And so to see not only the growth of the new company that he started, but the continued investment in that environment, I think shows that, yes, all this cool stuff, artificial intelligence is important, but just the basic need to make sure you get payroll done every week is important too, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Going back to my time in HR, that's what I always try and stay focused on, because at the end of the day, right, you need to be able to sort of build that foundation first. And that's why, so many of these focuses are on that automation side, so that you can sort of get those tasks that should be done by computer kind of completed. So you can kind of focus more on seeing the big picture, thinking about where it needs to go and how you can support the business in meeting their objectives and creating that alignment. But you have to be 100% sure that all of your information is correct, that automation is done right, because as you said, that's really the most important thing. Certainly it is to your customers, AKA your employees, right? So
it is. And part of the reason that this additional funding was raised, they had not planned to do a raise actually right now. This is Series E for them. So it's getting a little bit, they've sort of gone down the path quite some ways. They do say this is the last raise they plan to make. That doesn't mean that's the last raise they will make, but that they plan to make. But part of the reason why they made this raise was because of the SVP bank collapse in the Bay Area. And more importantly, that was Rippling's primary bank. And because of that, they were running payroll for a lot of organizations through that bank, which then caused a lot of organizations to have, they had to then basically cover payroll for money that was kind of stuck in limbo for a little while. And that was where some of that raise was put forward. And now they've moved over to JP Morgan as their primary bank. So, and my understanding, I don't know for sure, I haven't seen all the data come in. My understanding is though that they pretty much made everybody whole, maybe not exactly on like that Friday when things were sort of going down with the SVB bank, but they made them whole within, the next day or so. And that, paychecks were cut the way they were supposed to be. And that's part of why Rippling felt like they had received the money, was that there was trust in them sort of managing things the way they needed to manage them. But it also goes back to the fact that you've got to connect, make sure that sort of not only are the algorithms, the technology, all that working well, but the institutions that are being connected to your systems, the processes where they're running their processes through, especially if it's finances. These seem like basic conversations, but they're just as important as any feature functionality conversation, right?
That's exactly it. Think about what's important sort of to you as an employee, right? And think about what that, sometimes we can, I have been talking a lot and about the sort of strategic side, but it's important to put yourself in the mindset of those employees and think about what's most important for them. And then that can help you actually focus on the direction for your strategy. And that's exactly where that alignment should be taking place.
Well, I know we're already over, Cliff, but I do think that the EEOC thing that you had was important. So maybe just a quick comment on what that is, and then we'll wrap up for today. And hopefully everybody will forgive us for being a little bit 15 minutes over today.
Yeah. And I misspoke. It was NLRB.
Okay.
So yes, it was the National Labor Relations Board, but this has an effect on non-union workers as well. This has been of a lot of interest for any of you that have to do with severance agreements. It was the actual case was McLaren McComb. And remember that we are not a firm of attorneys. This is not constituted advice. This is just ours passing along a story. And it has to do with the fact that non-disparagement agreements that are put as part of severance agreements, especially for those who work in high tech, this can be a common part of these, or any of you who work with employees who, may have connections to the press or where your particular company is often in the news. These broad-based non-disparagement agreements that say things like, hey, you can't say anything bad about our company to anyone at any time, have been ruled as non-valid. And so it may be worth reviewing what your policies are and limiting the scope, or at least putting in some language that if part of your severance agreement becomes invalid due to later court rulings, that does not affect the rest of it, because that is something we're seeing, because this is a retroactive ruling. It goes back for those employees who have been cut or released that have been, especially if you've gone after them for violation, that will no longer be the case. Now, these sort of rulings are not necessarily permanent, but that is where we stand as of now. So just definitely worth keeping an eye on. This kind of goes back to that day-to-day sort of stuff. But I think in general, it always is a good practice to be very precise and direct with the scope of any of your agreements with your employees, right? You can never probably put these broad-based things about nobody at any time, anywhere in any of our contractual agreements.
Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe at some point we'll get some more of those who deal with employment law onto our sort of sister show in HR. We have a problem with Terry Zipper, because I think there are a lot of things changing right now, and some of them are fluid, like you said. Some of them are based on sort of court cases that are happening as we speak, as we had mentioned earlier, with some of the stuff going on with recruiting decisions and bias and stuff that's being made right now. I'm a big proponent of making sure that, you're continuously reviewing those kinds of documents, that they should not sit on your shelf for years and years and years, because again, sometimes they're also saying things that you just no longer fit your values, right? Because we as organizations have changed and our approach to the world has changed. And you always want to make sure that you're sort of appropriately managing documents that you're asking their employees to sign or to sort of include in sort of the overall communications of the organization. So good call out, Cliff. Well, Cliff, we've wrapped up things today. Any other last minute items that you wanted to mention before we headed into our closing this afternoon?
No, just that it really was wonderful to get to meet everyone in person, and that, it really is great to see how everyone's feedback, all of you listening at home, your feedback is very valuable to us. And because we are going to be launching this survey in just about, I think, 4 podcasts from now or so, I would love to hear from any of you on any comments, anything you would like to hear about or see us get into further. And that goes not just for the survey, but this podcast as well. And all of our contact information is about to come from Stacey. And thank you.
Thanks, Cliff. I appreciate it. And I would agree. We always love when we get a chance to get out and see everyone. And if anybody will be at the I Am Phenom event, I'll be there next week as well. I'm back in California for a client event. And I think there's a couple other events that we've got coming up, but we'll put them in the newsletter. So please be sure to watch our newsletter for where else you might be able to touch base with us. A quick reminder for all of our listeners that we mentioned the annual HR system report. You can access both the key findings, which is a little shorter than the 175-page actual report. Both the key findings and the actual report can be downloaded from our homepage at sapientinsights.com. And definitely be sure to, if you're interested in getting more in-depth data or support in your HR strategy journey, just drop us a line at info@sapientinsights.com to schedule some time to chat with us. And then sign up for our newsletter to get ongoing updates on research launches, where we'll be speaking or visiting, and when you can participate in the annual survey, which, as Cliff mentioned, will be around May 9th this year. I want to thank you again, Cliff, for always helping me get all the data pulled together for our podcast each week. It's great to have someone to sort of collaborate with on these conversations. And thank you to our production team, including Brand Method Media Group, who helps us produce our podcast and run by their amazing founder, Kelly Kelly. And our marketing team, Lisa Renko and Zoe Britton, who make sure all of this gets pulled together and it gets put out and available so you guys can access it and we can make sure that we get it out to everyone. And then most importantly, thanks to our listeners and the community. We couldn't do this without you. The goal is to make sure that we are providing information and data that is valuable to you on a weekly basis. So that's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it can be just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. I promise I'm going to find a better tagline at some point, but we'll get there. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review where you grab your your podcast. Those are really important to us and to the people who make decisions about which podcasts get placed in what places. Please stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and get all the behind the scenes content. And you can follow me at any events that I'm going to through Sapient Insights or Stacey Harris HR on LinkedIn or Twitter, as well as Cliff at Clifford Darrell with 2 R's and 2 L's. We were just talking about that. Cliff was very upset someone else had taken his handle on Twitter. So that's how you can find Cliff at Clifford Darrell, 2 R's, 2 L's. And we'll be back in just 2 weeks with another pot of HR tech updates and insights for everyone. Bye.